Hello, darling. I'm sad to say that the topic of war has been on my mind too much lately. Perhaps you feel the same. War is not diplomacy, war is not peace. War is death, and should only ever be the option of last resort. We forget at our own peril the human cost of warfare. It's in this spirit that I present tonight's story. I hope you enjoy. My Dad is in Vietnam. Growing up, it was easiest for Buck to tell people that his father was dead. This was often shocking to other children who were unused to facing mortality. It made short work of the smiling faces of adults, and Buck usually hated seeing this. There were times, though, when he delighted in it, thinking it a good punishment for foolish adults who asked intrusive questions and who, unlike children, ought to know better. The question of life and death was not simple, however. To the world, Buck's father was dead. He died in 1975, according to the Army, a few months after Buck was born, when his helicopter went down somewhere in Vietnam. Yet there were a few people, like his mother or his paternal grandmother and some of his mother's friends, who did not believe this, or at least said they did not. They said Buck's father was alive, but something had happened to him that made it so he couldn't come home. Their nightmare was that he was languishing in a Viet Cong prison, even 10 years after the fighting was over. Or maybe he had amnesia, or got hurt so badly that he couldn't explain who he was. All of these scenarios were dreadful, and to Buck as he got older, it seemed strange to wish for this rather than death. But eventually he understood. He never knew his father, and therefore could not miss him, while those around him missed him terribly, and always would. Buck was, like all young children, inclined to believe what his mother told him. He therefore grew up believing that his family were good people, that America was a good place, that Jesus was real, and that his dad was alive. He remembered clearly being about 7 or 8 and truly questioning for the first time if his dad might be dead after all. Initially, it was a doubt that he pushed away. No, he told himself, Mom knew best. If she said he was alive, then he was. But as Buck grew up, and the Vietnam Memorial Wall was built, and remains continued to come home, somewhere along the way, he realized that he no longer believed. He kept this opinion silently, though, because he knew how it would distress his mother. Buck's parents, Janice and Rob, were only together about 5 years. They married in 1973, and it wasn't long before Rob was drafted. He took it in stride, worrying about his family, but showing little fear for his own safety. This, too, was something Buck couldn't imagine. Just the thought of gym class was enough to make him nervous. To be forced to leave your whole world behind, to go fight for your life in a jungle, he couldn't process it. He would run away before they could take him. He knew he would, and he didn't feel any shame about that. It was just too much to ask of someone so young. Buck was born in 1975. Janice was alone in the delivery room, though her parents and Rob's mom were outside waiting. Janice named her son Robert Benjamin Jr. after his father. It was Rob's mother who first called the new baby Bucky, which had been Rob's nickname until he started school. But with his son, the name would stick for a lifetime. Buck was an infant when the news came that his dad was missing, so he couldn't remember it, of course, and he was glad, because he knew it must have been quite a scene. He thought of his mom, barely 20 years old at the time, trying to care for a brand-new baby, after being told that her husband was lost and probably dead and not coming back. She waited for confirmation that he was either dead or alive, but the war ended and years passed, and that confirmation never came. Instead, a picture of Rob went up in Bucky's nursery, a photograph of an almost ridiculously handsome man, the tall and dark type, not in his army uniform, but in a red flannel shirt, leaning against a pickup truck. He'd never been much of a hippie, and always had a clean-cut look. The all-American boy, that's what people had called him. He was only 25. But Buck grew up knowing that was his daddy. And while he couldn't precisely love his father, he did admire him and honored him, and he called this love for his mother's sake. So that was how Buck grew up. His father was both alive and not alive, and so Buck understood that grayness instinctively, the pain of ambiguous loss, the way it made a ghost of the man and his memory a legend. The army eventually declared Rob killed in action, based on whatever they knew, which they never shared with Janice to her satisfaction. Still, sometimes Buck pictured his dad, gaunt and bearded and grey now, in a cage somewhere. More often, he imagined that his dad was probably bones in a dense jungle. He never imagined his dad actually coming home one day, stepping off a plane in a clean new uniform, maybe with a scar or a limp or in a wheelchair, but still enough of the man he had been that Janice would run to him, shaking with joy. Such images only came to Buck's mind when Janice talked about them, carelessly sharing her fantasies aloud in front of her son. There had been stories like that, sure, but the last ones had been a long time ago. And this was how Buck and Janice lived, in the house that Janice and Rob bought for their new family, and which his death benefits helped them to pay for. Janice had a clerical job at the phone company, where she'd been since she got her first real job at 21. They were in a neighborhood of small homes with small yards. They were the first family to ever live in their house. And while the first families of the neighboring homes all eventually moved away, on to greener pastures, Buck and Janice stayed. It was what they could afford. Buck wasn't deprived, though. He had an Atari game system, Star Wars and G.I. Joe toys, a bicycle, and other things. Janice smoked too much, but hadn't had a drink since her pregnancy. She rarely dated. Mother and son got on well with one another. They were an average family, except for Buck always having to explain how his dad was dead. One Friday night, in the summer of 1985, someone rang the doorbell when Janice was about to serve dinner. "I'll get it," Buck shouted cheerily, rushing to the door. He opened the heavy inner door, knowing that the screen door was still locked. In reality, it wasn't much of a barrier, but to a 10-year-old, still confident in the imperviousness of the home, it felt like plenty. Janice heard the door open, and heard Buck's normally cheerful greeting drop off at once. There was silence, and Janice didn't trust silence. "Buck?" she called. When there wasn't an immediate reply, she set down the pot she'd been holding, nearly burning her hands, and ran to join her son at the door. There was a man standing there, his age difficult to tell. He was very skinny. He wore some sort of army jacket, probably from the surplus store, as it looked beat to hell. He had blue jeans on, and a flannel shirt, and old tennis shoes that used to be white and were now worn halfway through. Buck was holding the front door open, staring up at the stranger through the screen door, his face scrunched up with something that Janice couldn't immediately place. Anger? Disgust? Had this strange man said something to her son, maybe made some sort of rude or perverted comment? But then Buck turned to her. He still had some baby fat in his cheeks, but he looked more like Rob every day. And that's when it hit her. She looked at the man at the door again. Dark hair, parted, thinning, graying. Big blue eyes, red-rimmed, like he'd been crying. But then he looked from the boy to her, and his eyes flashed, and it was like lightning, just like the night they met. "Janny?" he said. His voice was so weak, so quiet, like he only had one bead left in his maracas. But immediately she screamed, not in horror, but shock, disbelief. Her whole body tingled and went numb and then hot. She pushed open the screen door, breaking the lock, and threw her arms around the man's neck. "Where have you been?" she said, burying her face against his shoulder. Her body was convulsing, shaking so much that Buck could hardly make out what she was saying. The man just held her, and in a second the lines, the years, the touch of madness that Buck detected there seemed to disappear from his face. And then Buck, though they were strangers, recognized him too. And this was how he met his father. Yes, he knew who it was. After all, he'd gone to sleep for more than 10 years with the man's photograph looking down at him. Buck was shy around adults, and normally, if he could, he hid. Grown-ups made him nervous because he'd learned that they didn't listen, they didn't pick up on cues, and would humiliate a child without a second thought, thinking it all a joke. Aside from his grandmothers, who he loved, he'd never felt very close to the rest of his family. Now, faced with this stranger, who he also knew, he felt none of that usual shyness. He didn't feel that his father would be like those other adults. Buck thought his father would be more understanding than that. Yet, at the same time, he did not feel the outpouring of love that his mother did. He wished he felt it, for his father's sake if nothing else, but he didn't. The man was still an unknown. They were to each other. And Rob seemed to feel some of this too, for when, still in Janice's embrace, he finally opened his eyes, they settled on Buck, yet there were no tears and no immediate signs of recognition. Janice was sobbing, laughing, and babbling incoherently. It went on that way for a few moments, Rob returning her embrace stiffly, and Buck just standing there, still holding the door. When Janice finally pulled away, her face was red and swollen like she'd been in a fight. The mascara she'd put on for work that morning was all smeared down her cheeks from her tears. She was shivering, but through it all, she somehow managed to smile at her son and say, "Bucky, this is Rob. It's your dad." Neither Buck nor Rob moved for a moment. But finally Rob stepped forward, and it took everything in Buck to not take a step back in retreat. His father's eyes, they were too big, too blue, too bright. He looked more than a little crazy. Yet Buck did not retreat. He held his ground like a good little soldier. And so when Rob collapsed to his knees, still expressionless, yet with tears flowing down his own cheeks, something inside of Buck shifted. "You do love me," Buck thought. "I don't understand this, but you're my daddy." And when the man held out his arms, Buck collapsed into them, and he, too, began to weep. Finally, Janice got them all inside. Buck could tell, just looking at his mother, how her mind was racing with questions. Where had he been? What had he endured? But it would all wait. It had to. They lived in a little split entry, and Rob struggled up the few steps to the living room. He collapsed on the couch like he'd just walked for 100 miles. Yet when Janice helped him take off his shoes, there was none of the smell that Buck expected. His socks looked clean, dry, and brand new, like he hadn't walked anywhere at all. "Thirsty," was all he said. Janice got him a beer, and he downed it quickly. He ended up going through several more. He didn't sleep, but seemed to settle into a torpor, eyes open and aware, but body motionless and silent. "Are you hungry, baby?" Janice asked him. "I made pot roast, just the way you like it. Bucky loves it too." He replied, but Buck couldn't hear what was said. Janice was whispering to him, crying again, giggling, stroking his hair. She made a plate for him, and he did eat. Buck sat at the dining room table just a few feet away, eating his own meal and looking at his parents. His parents! What an odd thought. Sometimes Rob would just stare at Janice as she babbled happily. Then his eyes would drift to Buck, and to Buck they felt both warm and dead. Then his eyes might drift to the television, droning on, ignored, or they might wander to nowhere at all, which he seemed to get lost in. Rob didn't say much that night. When Janice told him she loved him, he said it back, and he squeezed her hand, staring into her eyes. Otherwise, his answers were mostly one word. Did he have anything, maybe a backpack or something left outside? No. Had he been to see anyone, or did anyone else know he was back? No. So, he came home to his wife and son before anything else? Yes. Did he know that his mother had since passed away? He did. But again, when asked where he'd been, he said nothing. His blue eyes just stared at the window or the ceiling light or his empty plate. Buck said nothing to his father. He just watched him, his mother fussing and crying and laughing while Rob, as the hours passed, remained mostly silent, but he did begin to smile at his wife. There was no thought of routine that night, of washing dishes or of bedtimes. But when 3 a.m. rolled around and Janice realized her son was still awake, still at the dining table, watching, she said he should go to sleep. Rob just looked at Buck, yet Buck went to him and embraced him. He could feel his father's warmth and something that remained of his strength. Rob held on to his son tightly, and when Buck pulled away, finally he said, "I love you, son." Buck held his tears until he was in bed alone, because he thought that's what a good little soldier does. He was still awake a short time later, when he heard his mother take his father to bed. Buck would have been mortified any other time to hear his mother take a man into her room. But this was his father and her husband, or what was left of him. And Buck hoped they had a pleasant night together, whether or not they got up to what married people did. And he guessed that they had, because his mother was all smiles the next morning. She was in her robe making bacon and eggs, something Buck loved but that she rarely did, because she hated cleaning up the grease splatter mess from the bacon. And Rob was there at the kitchen table. He was wearing a brand-new white T-shirt and boxers that Buck knew Janice had bought for a past boyfriend of hers but never got around to giving him. So they'd sat in the closet until now. Rob's posture seemed less wooden than yesterday, though his face was still blank much of the time. He looked up when Buck entered and said, "Are you hungry, Buck?" He motioned for Buck to take the chair next to him, and for just a moment Buck saw something in his father's eyes, a deep sadness, a quiet pleading. And it made Buck sit immediately to do some little thing if he could to alleviate that pain. And then, to his own surprise, he leaned against his dad, who put an arm around him. Buck closed his eyes, absorbing it, this warmth, this love. My dad isn't dead, he thought, letting his father's feeling wash over him. Though it was strange, they ate in a peaceful silence. Janice's eyes were dancing, sparkling. Buck thought his mother looked years younger, just like that, and so pretty. To Buck's eyes, Rob was clearly a ghost of a man, someone who'd been through things he could not find words to describe. But Buck knew his mother saw none of that. She saw only her boy of a husband, returned from the grave, alive and therefore unchanged. She shot glances at Buck during their breakfast, and each time she smiled, her cheeks rosy. Buck had never seen her so content. When they were finished, Rob complimented Janice on the food, and she began to tidy up. Father and son looked at one another, and Buck thought, it's so strange. His face is young, but it's so weathered and so lined, like my grandpa's. He put his hand on Rob's shoulder, rubbing gently, and said, Are you ready to tell us, Dad, where you've been? Janice shot Buck a look. It wasn't a scolding look, but rather a nervous one. Buck guessed from that look that his mother had already been asking this, but the response had not been satisfactory. Buck thought that maybe he'd done something wrong, but then his father said, It's not that I don't want to answer, it's more I don't know how. This made Janice stop and turn to look at her husband. Buck said gently, What do you mean? Rob's eyes got that far-off look again, but his voice sounded stronger, more certain, when he answered. It's all just, he said quietly, looking at Buck. You know how in a dream you're just there, and you don't really know how you got there. It just is. Buck nodded, looking into his father's eyes, and Rob said, I want to tell you. I'm not keeping it from you. But when I think about it, it's hard to pick anything out. Janice looked like she was considering something as she listened to her husband. Then she crossed over to him, kneeling down beside him. She took his hand and said, Rob, let me take you to the VA hospital. The army must have brought you back. They must have. The hospital, they'll have records, right? Someone found you over there, and they brought you back. There must be a paper trail with dates and flights and all of that. Rob nodded. It made sense, of course. Coming home, he said, and his voice sounded so small and far away. I just wanted to go home so badly. But, Rob, you are home, Janice said. Her voice was quivering now. How quickly she'd gone from joy to pain. She was close enough for Buck to touch, so he did, pulling both parents into a clumsy child's embrace that was not quite wide enough nor strong enough to gather them both up. Janice chuckled, fighting her tears. Buck wanted so badly to protect them, but he knew that whatever this was, it was beyond him. After breakfast, Janice led Rob to the couch, and he settled down to rest in front of the television. Buck could see how she wanted to press the issue of the hospital, but Rob was like glass. Press too much and he might break. And then what? They'd be alone again. One of Buck's cartoons was on, and then an old movie, and then the news. Rob reacted to nothing. No laughter, no scowl, no commentary. Normally, Buck would play with his Star Wars or G.I. Joe figures on the living room floor, but he didn't that day. He didn't want to act out combat in front of his father. Eventually, Rob fell asleep. Buck found his mother in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, and there was a distant look in her eye that reminded Buck of his father. "Mama?" Buck said, touching her arm. He watched her come back to reality with a little jump. She turned to him and he asked, "When are we going to tell someone about Dad?" He would have expected, if something like this happened, that his mother would almost immediately begin a round of calls, telling all of their family and Rob's old friends that he was home. But she hadn't, nor had she gassed up the car and gotten groceries, as she did every Saturday. "What?" she asked, avoiding the real question. Buck said, "We have to tell someone, don't we? Something doesn't feel right." Janice looked angry for a second, but then she pulled her son in, hugging him close to her. "He's your father," she whispered into his hair, "and he's home. I don't know what happens now. But her voice trailed off, and Buck understood. He didn't know either. Still, they were badly in need of restocking their groceries, and with some effort, Buck managed to convince his mother it was all right to go do so. She did not take Rob with her to the store. He still seemed in no condition. Once they'd been alone for a few minutes, Buck joined his father on the couch. Rob was sitting up now, his head tipped back. It was the posture of a man in deep thought or lost in memory. Yet his expression, his eyes, were completely blank. Buck pressed himself up against his dad. Perhaps having more courage than his mother, he asked, "What happened when your helicopter went down?" It took a moment, but Rob looked down at his son, and he looked surprised by the question. Buck said, "I've heard about it all my life, but we never knew what really happened to you." Rob ruffled his son's hair and pulled the boy closer to him. "It was scary," he said. "Someone had fired at me from below and damaged the chopper. I remember looking out the windscreen and just seeing jungle forever. There was nowhere to land. It was like falling on a bed of nails. He shook his head, and his whole body shivered. It made Buck jump, and then hold on to his father more tightly. When a moment passed and Rob offered no more clarification, Buck asked, "Did they take you away somewhere? Did they put you in a jail?" Rob was looking up at the ceiling, that same empty look in his eyes again. But he pulled his son even closer, held him even more tightly. "So many years," he said. "Where did it all go? I was a boy flying over the jungle." He shook his head. "What happened to me?" They were still sitting like that, silent on the couch in front of the TV, when Janice got back home a short time later. She didn't get to see father and son holding on to each other, which was a shame. But Buck had to go down to help his mother unload the car. Janice gave Buck a look as they put the groceries away, as if saying, "Did you ask him anything you shouldn't?" But she didn't press the matter. That night, Janice made enchiladas for dinner. She had a special recipe, one that Rob had always loved. He came a bit more alive as they ate, laughing quietly at the banter between his wife and son, looking at his wife with love and longing as he recalled other nights before Buck was born when they shared this same meal. Afterward, he finally seemed awake, though still stiff. He moved and spoke slowly, but he asked them both many questions. He asked Janet about her old friends and how they were doing, and about the job at the phone company that she'd had all these years. He asked Buck how he felt about his upcoming year at school, and friends, and what he got up to outside the house. And when asked what he wanted to be someday, Buck said, probably a teacher and a dad, and this seemed to please Rob greatly. They were up late again, not talking especially much, just being together. Buck played with his cars. Janice did her weekly cleaning, and Rob sat, first at the dining room table, then on the couch, then on the bed he shared with his wife, just following them both through their routines like a shadow, enjoying watching them, seeing them live and loving them. Buck fell asleep on the couch, and in the wee hours he felt his father pick him up and carry him to bed. Buck was 10 years old, far too old and too big to be carried anywhere. Yet his father did this anyway, cradling his son against him and laying him gently upon his bed. Buck knew that this was something Rob had simply wanted to do, and Buck was surprised that he wanted it too, at least this once. Later, he was dimly aware of his parents talking in their room. At one point his mother sounded upset, and then it grew quiet again. Later on, Buck woke up and was quite sure that his parents were making love, but the idea didn't make him uncomfortable. Not now. Of course they were, as they should be, and he fell back to sleep. He was awakened in the morning by his mother. He knew at once that she had been crying. She sat on the edge of Buck's bed, looking at him, then embraced him. And when Buck asked her what was wrong, she said, "Rob's gone. He's just gone." And so he was, just like that. His clothing was gone, and he was gone. It was a shock, yet somehow it was not a surprise. As they held each other, Buck said, "I knew it would happen." And his mother surprised him when she kissed his cheek and said, "Yes, I think I did too." Janice was sure that she'd never heard Rob get out of bed, and the front door was still locked, which he shouldn't have been able to accomplish from the outside without his own set of keys. Buck hadn't heard anything either. Rob was just gone, leaving mother and son alone, heartbroken. And that weekend became something that they did not talk about. Both knew it had really happened, and they had one another as a witness. But it was too strange to share with other people, too unbelievable. It would sound like a sad fantasy born of denial, and neither Janice nor her son welcomed that type of pity. That was in 1985, and life went on. Janice kept working at the phone company, eventually moving up into management. Buck did well in school and went to a local college, earning his degree in 1997 and going on to teach English and history. It was 5 years after that, when Buck and his pregnant wife were living comfortably in their first 2-bedroom apartment, that Buck received an unexpected phone call from his mother. "They found your father," she said. A family liaison officer had come to her door that day in uniform to tell her. After nearly 3 decades, the remains of Warrant Officer Robert Benjamin Miller had been identified, having been found in heavy woodland east of Ho Chi Minh City. Buck would later read the reports himself. The Army believed Rob died during the crash or during a scuffle immediately thereafter, but from the condition of the remains, it was hard to say. "Wow," Buck said, to which Janice replied in kind. He heard her exhale. She'd taken up smoking again, which he didn't like. "Are you okay?" he asked her. She laughed and said of course. Then she asked him the same, and he too said, "Of course." There wasn't much to say. There might be later, once the news had settled in. There would have to be a funeral, and maybe then they would have words. But there were none just now. Buck had brought the photo of his father with him when he moved out on his own. The same image that had hung over his crib was now over the mantel, with his wedding photo, the photo of his mother and grandmothers, pictures of his in-laws, and now the newest edition, an ultrasound of the son that he and his wife would soon have. Buck's wife had advocated for naming their son Robert Benjamin III, but Buck wasn't quite sold on that yet. Buck's poor wife, sore and exhausted after a long day, went to bed early. Buck promised he'd join her, but he ended up looking at the photo of his dad for a long time. With each milestone in his life, he'd appreciated anew the gravity of all that was stolen from that smiling young man leaning against his pickup truck, and how that loss had rippled out like a stone dropped in a pool, always more ripples. But now, he said, now it was over. What was left of Rob was coming home, and Buck's son would know who his grandfather was, and Buck would never, ever leave his boy, no matter what. Buck went out onto their balcony. There was a narrow strip of road below with manicured landscaping, but beyond that was a dark cornfield all the way to the horizon. He asked himself in this moment of quiet reflection, how many spirits must walk the earth? Shadows and echoes of men who have come and gone, but whose love is great enough to hold just a little part of them here for a time, maybe a weekend, just a little while. Probably as many as there were stars or fireflies or ears of corn, he thought. Buck wasn't religious, but he said a prayer for his dad and wiped away his tears. Growing up, Buck had told people that his father was dead. After Rob came back, Buck started telling people that his dad was missing in action, and that they would probably never know for sure. Only to his wife had he ever told the real story of that weekend, and that his father was something he could not explain. All of these were pieces of the truth, but just pieces. Buck's dad went to Vietnam, and Buck knew that no matter what became of Rob's bones, he would probably always be there. I'll conclude tonight's episode with this simple message. Choose peace, and choose wisely. The decisions we make ripple forward through time, and the consequences do not end when our lives do. Choose, and hope that there is still time for our choices to matter. Until next time, don't forget me. N'est-ce pas?